She was never supposed to be the bride. She was supposed to be the woman standing quietly in the third row, holding a small clutch, clapping politely while somebody else's life changed forever. In theory, Elena Ward's only job that morning was to show up, smile, and leave before the champagne ran out. In practice, one folded piece of ivory cardstock was about to rearrange the rest of her life, and nobody had bothered to warn her. The dress weighed more than she expected. Not because of the beading, or the layers of silk chiffon, or the small pearl buttons that ran the length of her spine like a row of tiny, stubborn promises. It weighed more because of what it meant, and what it didn't. Elena stood in the bridal suite of the Ashford estate at 7 in the morning, staring at herself in a mirror the size of a door, wearing a dress that was not hers, for a wedding that was not hers, and trying very hard not to cry and ruin the makeup a stranger had spent 40 minutes applying. Her phone buzzed on the vanity. A text from her best friend, Priya. "Tell me you're not actually going through with whatever this is." Elena typed back with shaking fingers. "I don't understand what's happening. Eleanor said there was a dress code mix-up and I needed to change here. Now there's a woman fixing my hair and calling me Miss Ward, almost ready, like I'm actually." She didn't finish the sentence because she didn't know how to. 6 days earlier, everything had made sense. Elena Ward was 26, an architect 2 years into her first real job at a small firm in the city, the kind of woman who ate lunch at her desk and measured her weeks in blueprints and coffee. She had grown up 2 houses down from the Ashfords, in the version of that neighborhood that existed before money multiplied itself into an empire. Her mother had cleaned for Eleanor Ashford for 11 years before cancer took her, and in that decade Eleanor had become something between an employer and a second mother, showing up at school recitals, slipping Elena scholarship applications, never once making her feel like the help's daughter. And Nathaniel Ashford had been the boy 2 years older who taught her to ride a bike in the Ashford driveway and later, much later, became the man whose face she thought about more than she wanted to admit. He didn't know that part. Nobody knew that part. It was supposed to stay buried under a decade of careful distance, under his rise to running a company worth more than some countries' economies, under his engagement to Vivian Calloway, daughter of a shipping magnate, a woman with a jaw sharp enough to cut glass and a smile that never once reached her eyes. Elena had received the wedding invitation like everyone else. Cream cardstock, gold foil, a date circled in her calendar with the vague dread of watching someone she loved marry someone who didn't deserve him. She'd bought a dress. Pale blue, modest, the kind of dress a woman wears when she has made peace with being furniture at someone else's happiness. She had rehearsed her congratulations in the mirror. She had told herself, out loud, more than once, that this was fine. That was 6 days ago. This was now. And now, a woman named Margot was pinning something delicate and glittering into Elena's hair while another woman steamed a train the length of a hallway, and nobody in the room seemed to find any of this strange except Elena, who felt like she'd fallen into someone else's dream and couldn't find the door back out. "Mrs. Ashford asked that we have you ready by 9, Margot said, tucking a final pin into place. "She said you'd understand the timing." Elena did not understand the timing. Elena understood nothing. 2 hours earlier, a car had arrived at her apartment before sunrise, sent by Eleanor Ashford herself, the note attached reading only, "We're something you can move in. I will explain everything. Trust me the way your mother trusted me." Elena had trusted Eleanor Ashford with everything that mattered to her for 15 years. So she had gotten in the car. She had been driven 40 minutes outside the city to the Ashford estate, ushered through a side entrance, and handed a garment bag by a woman who called her the bride so casually that Elena had actually turned around to look for someone else in the room. There had been no one else in the room. "There's been a mistake," Elena had said, laughing, because it seemed like the only sane response. "I'm a guest." "I'm not," Eleanor will explain, the woman had said, already unzipping the bag. "She said you'd say that." Now Elena sat very still while Margot fastened the final button, and stared at her own reflection, transformed into something unrecognizable, a woman in white in a room full of flowers, 40 minutes from an altar where a room full of powerful, watching people expected to see someone else. The door opened. Eleanor Ashford swept in wearing pale grey silk, 61 years old and moving like a woman half that age, the kind of presence that had once made corporate boards go quiet before she'd said a single word. She took one look at Elena and pressed both hands to her mouth. "Oh," she said softly. "Oh, you look exactly like I knew you would." "Eleanor." Elena's voice cracked. "What is happening? Where is Vivian? Why am I wearing this? Why does everyone keep calling me the bride?" Eleanor crossed the room and took both of Elena's hands in hers, the same way she had at Elena's mother's funeral 6 years earlier, steady and warm and entirely too calm for the size of the chaos she had clearly caused. "Vivian is not coming," Eleanor said. "Not because of anything you've done. Because of everything she's done. I have known for 4 months that she's been meeting with a man from a rival shipping consortium, discussing what happens to Ashford Maritime's merger contracts once she has a ring and access to my son's signature. I have proof. I have had proof since March. And I have spent 4 months deciding what to do with it." Elena's mouth had gone completely dry. "So you swapped the invitations?" "I redirected them," Eleanor said, with the precise, unbothered diction of a woman who had spent 40 years learning how to make catastrophic decisions sound like minor scheduling adjustments. "Vivian and her family believe the ceremony is at 4 o'clock at the Calloway Estate Garden, per an amended invitation I had printed and delivered personally 3 weeks ago. They are, at this very moment, almost certainly discovering an empty garden and a caterer with no instructions. Eleanor. The 200 guests currently seated in my ballroom," Eleanor continued, unbothered, "believe the ceremony begins at 10, at this house, as originally planned. They are correct. And Nathaniel." Elena's voice had dropped to barely a whisper. "Does Nathaniel know Vivian isn't coming?" "He has known since Tuesday," Eleanor said. "He does not yet know who is." The room tilted. Elena sat down hard on the edge of the vanity stool, her heart slamming so violently against the boning of the dress that she wondered if Margot could see it. "You can't do this," she managed. "You cannot just put a dress on me and walk me down an aisle toward a man who thinks he's marrying someone else. That is not a wedding, Eleanor, that is a hostage situation with better lighting." Eleanor laughed, sharp and delighted, and for a moment she looked exactly like the woman who used to sneak Elena extra cookies after her mother said no. "I am not putting you in front of a minister and forcing vows out of you, darling, I'm not a monster. I am simply arranging for the right woman to be standing at the end of that aisle when my son finally looks up and sees clearly, for the first time in 3 years, who he actually loves. What happens after that is entirely up to the two of you. He doesn't love me." The words came out smaller than Elena intended. "He's known me since I was 11. I taught myself not to be in love with him around age 19, for my own survival." "Did you?" Eleanor said, something knowing and unbearably gentle in her voice. "Then explain to me why, every single time he has come home these last 6 years, the first thing he asks isn't about the company, or his father's health, or even me. It's whether Sandra Ward's daughter still lives 2 streets over." Elena said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that, because her chest had gone tight and hot and something dangerously close to hope was climbing up her throat where dread used to live. Downstairs, in a room on the opposite wing of the house, Nathaniel Ashford stood in front of a mirror of his own, adjusting a bow tie with hands that would not stay steady. He was 32 years old, and he had built a shipping empire out of a company his grandfather started with 2 barges and a bank loan, and he had shaken hands with prime ministers without his pulse changing, and this morning he could not tie a piece of black silk without his fingers betraying him. His best man, a broad, easygoing man named Marcus Delacroix, watched from the doorway with the particular patience of someone who had known him since university and had therefore earned the right to say difficult things. "You've undone that 4 times. I'm aware. You want to tell me why the groom looks like a man walking into a boardroom to fire himself?" Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He set the tie down. "My mother told me on Tuesday that Vivian has spent 4 months negotiating a partnership behind my back with Callum Reyes at Northbridge Maritime, using information she had access to only because she was engaged to me. She showed me the emails. Marcus went very still. And you're still getting married in 90 minutes? My mother told me not to cancel anything. She told me to trust her. She told me, and I quote, that by the time I reached the end of that aisle, everything would have resolved itself. Nathaniel picked the tie back up, tried again, failed again. I have spent my entire adult life making decisions with complete information, Marcus. I don't know how to stand still and let someone else hold the variables. So why are you standing still? Nathaniel didn't answer right away. He looked at his own reflection, at the version of himself that boardrooms and courtrooms and merger tables had built over a decade, controlled, unreadable, a man who had trained every soft thing out of his own face because softness, in his world, got exploited. And underneath that reflection, buried the way it had been buried for years, was a version of himself that still remembered exactly what it felt like to be 19 years old, watching a girl 2 streets over ride away on her bicycle for the last time before she left for university, wanting to say something and saying nothing instead. Because my mother has never once, in 61 years, made a decision without a reason, he said finally. And because some small, stupid part of me has been waiting 3 years to find out what that reason actually is. At 9:52, a string quartet began playing in the ballroom below, and 200 guests who believed they were about to watch Nathaniel Ashford marry Vivian Calloway settled into their seats with champagne flutes and quiet anticipation, entirely unaware that the bride currently being laced into her dress 2 floors above them had never once, in her entire life, expected to be standing where she now stood. Elena caught her own reflection one more time before Eleanor took her hand. White silk. Trembling shoulders. A face she barely recognized, caught somewhere between terror and a hope she had spent 6 years pretending not to feel. I can't do this, she whispered. You can, Eleanor said, threading Elena's arm through her own, steady as stone. You've been doing it since you were 11 years old, darling. You've just never had permission before. Consider this me, finally, giving it to you. The doors to the hallway opened. Somewhere beyond them, the music shifted into something slower, something final, and Elena Ward, 26 years old, an architect who had never once expected her own life to feel like a blueprint someone else had drafted, took her first step toward a door she could not yet see through. The ballroom of the Ashford estate had been built in 1911, with a domed ceiling painted to look like a summer sky, and on ordinary days Elena would have wanted nothing more than to stand beneath it and study the brushwork. Today she saw none of it. She saw only the impossibly long stretch of white runner between the doors and the altar, and the man standing at the end of it, and the 200 faces that turned, as one, when the quartet shifted into the opening bars of the processional. She heard the collective intake of breath before she understood what caused it. It took her a moment to realize it wasn't shock at the wrong bride. It was something else entirely, a ripple of recognition, of soft murmured names passing row to row. Sandra Ward's girl. That's little Elena. Didn't she used to live on Marlowe Street? The Ashford boy used to follow her around like a duckling, remember? Most of these people had known her family for decades before money and mergers had rearranged the neighborhood into something unrecognizable. She was not, to this room, a stranger being smuggled into someone else's wedding. She was a girl they remembered, grown up, wearing white, and half of them were already smiling before she'd taken 3 steps. She did not see any of that yet. She saw only Nathaniel. He stood at the altar in a black suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who had grown used to expensive things, but his face had none of the composure she remembered from photographs, from boardroom interviews, from the careful, unreadable mask he wore for cameras. His face, in the moment he turned and saw her walking toward him instead of Vivian, cracked open completely. Shock first. Then something rawer. Then, unmistakably, before he could stop it or hide it or bury it back under a decade of discipline, something that looked exactly like relief. Marcus, standing beside him as best man, leaned in and murmured something Elena couldn't hear. Nathaniel didn't respond. He was already stepping forward, off the altar, closing the distance between them and the aisle itself, which was not part of any ceremony Elena had ever witnessed. Elena. Her name came out of him like he'd forgotten how to use it and was relearning in real time. I didn't know, she said, low, urgent, for his ears only, though 200 people were straining to hear regardless. I swear to you, I didn't know any of this until an hour ago. Your mother. I know what my mother did. His eyes hadn't left her face. I found out 10 minutes ago, when Marcus got a call from the Calloway estate asking why nobody was there to greet an empty garden full of caterers. A ripple of laughter moved through the front rows, low and startled, the sound of 200 people realizing simultaneously that they were witnessing something far more interesting than the wedding they'd been invited to. So you know Vivian isn't coming. I know Vivian was never going to walk down this aisle again the moment I saw those emails, Nathaniel said. What I didn't know, until about 90 seconds ago, was that my mother had a plan for what happened after. Eleanor Ashford, still standing at Elena's side with the serene composure of a woman entirely unbothered by the chaos she had engineered, patted Elena's arm and stepped back, folding her hands in front of her like a woman settling in to watch a play she had personally written, directed, and cast. I am not going to force you into anything in front of 200 witnesses and a minister who is, frankly, extremely confused right now, Nathaniel said, quieter now, just for her. I need you to understand that. Whatever happens next, it happens because you choose it, not because my mother built a stage and expects us both to perform on it. Elena's throat had gone tight. Then what happens next? He was quiet for a long moment, and in that moment she watched something shift behind his eyes, the last of the careful control finally giving way to something he had clearly been holding back for years, maybe longer than either of them wanted to admit out loud. I think, he said slowly, that I have spent 3 years engaged to a woman I never once introduced to my own mother's kitchen, and I never once stopped to ask myself why that felt normal. And I think somewhere underneath every merger and every courtroom and every carefully controlled version of myself I've built since I was 22, there has been exactly one person I have never once managed to stop thinking about, and she just walked down an aisle toward me wearing white, and I have absolutely no intention of pretending I don't know what that means. The minister, a kind, elderly man named Father Osei who had officiated 3 generations of Ashford family events, cleared his throat gently. I feel I should mention, for the sake of clarity, that I was engaged to marry a couple named Nathaniel and Vivian this morning. Change of plans, Father, Nathaniel said, without looking away from Elena. So I gathered. Father Osei's mouth twitched. Might I ask what plans you'd like instead? Nathaniel didn't answer the minister. He looked at Elena, and the 200 guests, and his mother standing serenely at the edge of the aisle like a woman who had just watched a business plan close exactly as projected, all faded into something distant and unimportant. I'm not going to marry you today, he said quietly, only to her, though the front 3 rows heard every word and would repeat it for years. That's not what today is. But I would very much like to take you out of this dress and into a car and away from every single person currently pretending not to listen to us, and I would like to spend however long it takes explaining exactly how long I have been in love with you, if you'll let me. Somewhere behind them, an Aunt Elena didn't recognize burst into tears. Somewhere else, Marcus Delacroix let out a low whistle of pure disbelief. Eleanor Ashford smiled the small, satisfied smile of a woman whose plan had worked exactly as well as she had known it would. Elena looked at the man she had spent 6 years training herself not to love, standing in front of her in a suit meant for another woman's wedding, offering her nothing certain and everything real, and for the first time all morning, she stopped being afraid. Yes, she said. To all of it. Start explaining. If this story is pulling at your heart already, take a second to like it and subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep telling stories like Elena and Nathaniel's. The car Nathaniel drove was not one of the 6 vehicles registered to Ashford Maritime's corporate fleet. It was a decade-old pickup truck he kept in a garage 2 miles from the estate, the one piece of his life that had never once appeared in a press photo, and he drove it with the wedding still half dismantled behind them, Elena beside him in the passenger seat with her veil balled up on her lap and her shoes kicked off onto the floor mat. Your mother is going to have 200 confused guests and a caterer with no instructions, Elena said, laughing despite herself, the adrenaline still working its way out of her system in unpredictable waves. My mother, Nathaniel said, has been planning a contingency reception for this exact outcome for approximately 3 weeks. There is a second cake. I found out about the second cake this morning, from the pastry chef, who assumed I already knew. Elena turned to stare at him. There's a second cake. Chocolate. My favorite, not Vivian's. I didn't think anything of it until about an hour ago. They drove in comfortable silence for a while, past the hedgerows and stone walls that marked the boundary between the Ashford estate and the rest of the world, until Nathaniel pulled off onto a gravel road Elena hadn't seen in years, one that led down toward the small lake where the two of them had spent an entire childhood summer building a dock that never once held its shape through a single winter. He parked. Neither of them moved for a moment. I need to explain some things, he said finally, hands still on the wheel, looking out at the water instead of at her, which she recognized immediately as a habit from childhood. Nathaniel Ashford had never once been able to say anything difficult while looking directly at the person it was about. About Vivian. About why I let an engagement happen with someone I never loved, and why I let it go on for 3 years instead of ending it the moment I knew it was wrong. You don't owe me an explanation for your own life, Nathaniel. I think I do, actually. I think I've owed you one since I was 22. He exhaled, long and slow. My father died 4 months before Vivian and I met. The company was in freefall, half the board wanted to force a sale, and everyone from the family lawyers to my own mother told me that what Ashford Maritime needed, more than anything, was stability. A partnership. A marriage that looked, from the outside, like a merger the market could trust. Vivian's family controlled port access I needed. It made sense on paper. Every single part of it made sense on paper. And on paper isn't the same as real. No, he said. It very much is not. He finally turned to look at her. I told myself for 3 years that the version of my life where I chased what I actually wanted had died with my father, along with the version of me who used to think there was time for things like that. I built a very good life out of decisions that made sense on paper. And every single year, around the holidays, I would come home, and I would ask my mother whether Sandra Ward's daughter still lived 2 streets over, and I would tell myself that was just nostalgia. Just an old habit. Not a question that meant anything. Elena's chest had gone tight in a way that had nothing to do with the dress. It meant something. It meant everything, he said. It has meant everything since I was 19 years old and watched you ride away on that bicycle the summer before you left for university, and I didn't say a single word, because I told myself I had time, and then I told myself I didn't have the right, and then somewhere along the way I told myself I had simply moved on, which was the biggest lie I have ever managed to convince myself of, and I have negotiated $400 million contracts. Elena laughed, wet and startled, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. That's a genuinely terrible thing to admit to someone in a truck. I'm aware. I had a much better version of this speech planned for approximately 10 years from now, in a scenario where I'd worked up the nerve, and instead my mother swapped a set of wedding invitations and forced the timeline forward by a full decade. He reached over, carefully, and took her hand, the way he had 1,000 times as a child and never once as an adult. I'm not asking you to marry me today. I'm not even asking you to decide anything today. I'm asking whether you'd let me spend the time I should have spent years ago, actually courting you properly, the way I should have before I ever let myself get talked into a contract dressed up as a wedding. Elena looked down at their joined hands, at the small, ordinary miracle of it, at a decade of careful distance finally closing into something that felt less like a leap and more like coming home. I taught myself not to love you when I was 19, she said quietly. It didn't work particularly well. I just got better at hiding it. I noticed, he said. I have been hiding the same thing since I was 19. We were both remarkably bad at a project neither of us actually wanted to succeed at. She laughed again, and this time it broke something loose in her chest that had been tight for 6 years, and when he leaned across the truck's bench seat and kissed her, carefully, slowly, like a question rather than an answer, she kissed him back like 6 years of careful distance had simply never happened at all. Behind them, back at the estate, Eleanor Ashford stood in the ballroom doorway watching caterers quietly will out a second cake, and allowed herself, for the first time all morning, a smile that reached all the way to her eyes. The gossip took exactly 11 days to reach every corner of the industry Nathaniel operated in, which Marcus Delacroix declared, over lunch at the small café near the Ashford Maritime headquarters, was a personal record even by the standards of a scandal involving a swapped bride. "They're calling it the Ashford switch," Marcus said, sliding his phone across the table. "There's a headline. Shipping heir ditches socialite fiancé at the altar for childhood sweetheart. Somebody leaked the part about the second cake. I don't know how anyone found out about the cake. The pastry chef gave an interview," Nathaniel said, not looking up from his coffee. Apparently he felt he deserved credit for his instincts. "Fair, honestly." Marcus studied him for a moment. "You look terrifyingly happy for a man whose personal life is currently a headline." Nathaniel didn't argue the point, because it was true, and because for the first time in years he had stopped bothering to perform the version of himself that pretended not to feel things in front of other people. Vivian Calloway had issued a statement through her family's lawyers, calling the entire situation a private matter she had no interest in discussing publicly, which everyone in the industry correctly interpreted as confirmation that the emails Eleanor had produced were exactly as damning as rumored. Northbridge Maritime had quietly distanced itself from any suggestion of a partnership discussion. The board, which had spent 3 years treating Nathaniel's engagement as a stabilizing asset, discovered within a week that Ashford Maritime stock hadn't moved half a point, and quietly stopped asking questions. Elena, for her part, had gone back to work at her architecture firm exactly 2 days after the wedding that wasn't, because she had a project deadline and because, as she informed Nathaniel with some asperity, she had absolutely no intention of letting her entire life get reorganized around a man's schedule twice in 1 month. "I like that you have deadlines that don't involve me," Nathaniel told her, the first time he showed up at her office uninvited, holding 2 coffees and looking distinctly out of place among the drafting tables and rolled blueprints. "It's a novelty. Most people in my life exist to be rearranged by my calendar." "I am extremely difficult to rearrange," Elena said, not looking up from the model she was building, a scale replica of a community housing project she'd been fighting the city planning board over for 8 months. "Ask anyone. I intend to spend considerable time confirming that personally." She did throw a ruler at him for that one, and he caught it without spilling either coffee, which she found significantly more attractive than she was willing to admit out loud. What followed over the next several weeks was nothing like either of them had expected, and exactly like what both of them, somewhere underneath a decade of careful distance, had always secretly wanted. Nathaniel learned that Elena argued about everything, from zoning law to the correct way to load a dishwasher, with the same unrelenting precision she brought to every blueprint she'd ever drafted, and that losing an argument to her felt somehow more satisfying than winning one against anyone else. Elena learned that Nathaniel, for all his boardroom composure, could not cook a single dish without setting off the smoke alarm, and that he kept, in a drawer in his study, a folded photograph of the two of them at 9 and 11 years old, sitting on the dock they'd built that never once survived a winter. "You kept this," she said, the first time she found it, turning it over in her hands with something soft and startled crossing her face. "I kept a great many things," he said, watching her instead of the photograph. "I was simply better than most people at pretending I hadn't." Eleanor Ashford, meanwhile, had taken to inviting Elena to Sunday dinners with the casual, unstoppable persistence of a woman who considered the matter settled and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. She showed Elena the drawer in the kitchen where Sandra Ward's recipe cards were still kept, worn soft at the corners from years of use, and told her, over a pot of the same stew Elena's mother used to make, that she had never once doubted this outcome, not for a single day in 15 years. "You could have just told him how you felt," Elena said, half laughing, half exasperated. "Instead of orchestrating an entire fake wedding logistics operation involving 2 cakes and a redirected invitation to another estate." "Darling, I did tell him," Eleanor said serenely, stirring the stew. "For 3 years. He simply wasn't listening, because he'd convinced himself listening wasn't allowed anymore. Sometimes a mother has to stop talking and start building a stage instead. It was on a Tuesday evening in late autumn, 6 weeks after the wedding that Elena came home to her apartment to find Nathaniel already there, having somehow acquired a key she hadn't remembered giving him, standing in her tiny kitchen with flour on his shirt and something that might have once been intended as bread cooling, badly, on the counter. "I wanted to cook for you," he said, before she could ask. "It did not go according to plan. Nothing involving you in a kitchen ever does." "No," he agreed. "But I wanted you to know I tried, before I said what I actually came here to say, because I thought it should be preceded by some evidence of effort, however catastrophic." Elena set her bag down slowly, watching something shift across his face, the same crack in his composure she'd seen at the altar 6 weeks earlier, unguarded and entirely real. "My mother has apologized exactly 0 times for what she did," he said. "I have started to believe she never will, because she considers the outcome sufficient justification for the method, which is a philosophy I have decided, against every instinct I own, that I largely agree with. I have spent 6 weeks courting you exactly the way I promised, properly, on your terms, with your deadlines intact, and I intend to keep doing precisely that for as long as it takes. But I wanted to tell you tonight, standing in a kitchen I've clearly ruined, that I am done pretending the timeline matters. I have loved you since I was 19 years old. I will very likely love you when I am 90. Whatever pace you need this to move at, I will match it, for as long as it takes, because I already know exactly where it ends." Winter came early that year, the kind that turned the Ashford estate's gardens into something out of a painting, frost lacing the hedgerows Elena had known since childhood, and by the time the first snow settled over the lake where a truck had once idled for an hour while 2 people finally said what they'd been avoiding for a decade, Elena Ward had moved into the guest cottage on the estate grounds, close enough to the main house for Sunday dinners, far enough to still call the space entirely her own. It was not, she told Priya over the phone, a decision she'd made lightly. "You realize you're describing falling in love with a man by way of a fraudulent wedding, a truck confession, and a ruined loaf of bread," Priya said. "This is not a normal love story, Elena." "No," Elena agreed, smiling into the phone as she watched Nathaniel through the cottage window, shoveling a path through the snow between his house and hers with far more effort than the task strictly required, clearly using it as an excuse to be visible from her kitchen. "It really isn't. The city planning board approved her housing project in December, after 8 months of fighting, and Nathaniel showed up at the hearing without telling her, sitting quietly in the back row in a suit that made 3 separate board members visibly reconsider their objections, though he insisted afterward, with a straight face she didn't entirely believe, that his presence had been purely coincidental. "You own 40% of the shipping contracts that supply the construction materials for half the projects that board approves," Elena said, unable to keep from laughing as they walked out into the cold together. "Your presence was not coincidental. I did not say a single word in that room. You didn't have to. You just had to exist in the back row looking like a man whose company could make their lives very difficult if they were unreasonable. That's an unfair characterization of my very neutral, very supportive attendance." She elbowed him, and he caught her hand instead of letting the moment pass, threading his fingers through hers the easy, practiced way that had become entirely natural between them somewhere over the previous months, without either of them marking exactly when it happened. Eleanor, for her part, had declared herself entirely satisfied with the outcome of her scheme and had moved on to a new project with characteristic single-mindedness, renovating the old boathouse by the lake, which she informed both of them, without any pretense of subtlety, would make an excellent venue for a wedding someday, should anyone ever find themselves in need of one. "Mother," Nathaniel said, the 3rd time she brought it up over dinner, "we have been together for 4 months. "I am 61 years old," Eleanor said serenely, passing the potatoes. "I do not have 4 months to spare on subtlety. I spent 15 years being patient about this particular outcome. I consider myself owed a certain amount of enthusiasm now that it's arrived." Elena, laughing into her wine glass, caught Nathaniel's eye across the table, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with the conversation and everything to do with a shared, unspoken certainty that had been building steadily for months, gathering weight the way snow gathered on the estate's old oak trees, quiet and inevitable and entirely undeniable. It was 2 weeks before Christmas when Nathaniel asked her to walk down to the lake with him after dinner, bundled against the cold, the boathouse renovation half finished and strung with the work lights the contractors had left overnight. He'd cleared a small space near the water, the same spot where the dock used to stand before every winter reliably destroyed it, and Elena felt something in her chest go very still the moment she saw the single lantern waiting there, and the small velvet box sitting beside it on an overturned crate, and Nathaniel's hands, steady this time, reaching for it. "I had an entire speech prepared," he said, "involving the dock, and the bicycle, and probably something about shipping metaphors I'd have regretted by morning. I've decided against all of it. That seems wise. I want to say something simpler instead." He knelt, the snow soaking instantly into the knee of his trousers, and he didn't seem to notice or care. "I have spent most of my adult life building a version of myself that made sense on paper. Contracts, mergers, decisions with complete information. You are the only thing in my life I have never once needed complete information about, because somehow, since I was 19 years old, I have simply known. My mother swapped a set of wedding invitations because she got tired of waiting for me to be brave enough to do this properly, and I have spent every day since being grateful she did, and also determined to do this part exactly right, on my own terms, when I actually meant it instead of when a contract demanded it." Elena's hands had come up to cover her mouth, tears already blurring the lantern light into something soft and golden. "Marry me," Nathaniel said. "Not because a room full of guests is expecting it, not because a board needs stability, not because anyone but the two of us has any say in it at all. Marry me because I have loved you since before I understood what the word meant, and I have absolutely no interest in spending another decade pretending otherwise." "Yes," Elena said, before he'd even fully finished, the word coming out on a laugh and a sob at once. "Yes, obviously yes, you enormous, ridiculous man, get up, your knee is going to freeze." He laughed, the sound of it carrying out over the frozen lake, and slid the ring onto her finger with hands that, for once in his composed and careful life, were shaking freely and without apology, and when he pulled her into him and kissed her beside the half-finished boathouse his mother had started renovating months before either of them had officially decided on anything, it felt less like a beginning than like the ending of a much longer story finally arriving where it had always been headed. The wedding, when it finally happened, was nothing like the one that hadn't. It was held in June, at the finished boathouse by the lake, with exactly 60 guests instead of 200, no press releases, no board considerations, no merger dressed up in white silk. Elena designed the space herself, down to the placement of every string light and the exact angle of the wooden arch under which she and Nathaniel would eventually stand, because she had spent an entire career learning how spaces should feel and had no intention of leaving her own wedding to anyone else's blueprint. Priya stood as maid of honor, still periodically shaking her head at the sheer improbability of the story whenever she thought no one was watching. Marcus stood as best man again, having earned the position twice now, which he pointed out repeatedly and with great satisfaction. Eleanor sat in the front row in pale blue silk, dabbing at her eyes throughout the entire ceremony with a handkerchief she'd clearly brought expecting exactly this outcome, looking like a woman who had waited 15 years for a single afternoon and found it worth every bit of the wait. Father Osei, officiating for the second time in a year for the same two names under considerably different circumstances, could not resist a small joke as the ceremony began. "I believe," he said, "that the last time I stood in front of these two, there was some confusion about which bride I was meant to be marrying." Laughter rippled through the small crowd, warm and easy, nothing like the startled murmurs of the ballroom months before. "I can confirm," Nathaniel said, looking at Elena and only Elena, "that there is no confusion this time. There never should have been any in the first place. The vows were simple." Elena spoke about blueprints and foundations, about how a good structure was built not on the loudest material but on the one that could bear weight quietly, year after year, without ever needing to announce itself, and how she had spent years underestimating exactly what she'd found in the boy who taught her to ride a bike because he had never once needed to announce himself either. Nathaniel spoke about contracts and mergers and every decision he had ever made with complete information, and how the only decision in his entire life that had ever mattered had required none of that at all, just a decade of patience and a mother bold enough to force his hand when his own courage failed him. To my mother, he added, glancing toward the front row, where Eleanor was now openly crying, who I will never, under any circumstances, forgive for redirecting a set of wedding invitations without my knowledge, and who I will also never, under any circumstances, be able to properly thank for it. Eleanor laughed through her tears, waving a hand at him to continue, and the small crowd laughed with her, and Elena, looking out at all of it, the lake, the finished boathouse, the 60 people who actually mattered instead of 200 who'd been invited for optics, felt something settle into place that had been unsteady for years, a foundation finally set exactly where it belonged. They danced their first dance to nothing fashionable, just an old song Sandra Ward used to hum while she worked, one Eleanor had remembered and requested specifically, and Elena danced with her eyes closed for most of it, feeling her mother's presence in the melody the way she hadn't in years, grief and joy tangled together in a way that felt, for the first time since the funeral, more like peace than pain. Later, much later, after the cake had been cut, chocolate, Nathaniel's favorite, no confusion this time about whose preference it reflected, and the guests had thinned to the handful who'd stay until the lanterns burned low, Elena found Nathaniel standing alone at the edge of the dock, the new one, the one that had actually been built to last through a winter this time, looking out over the water with the particular stillness she'd come to recognize as his version of overwhelmed. "Regretting anything?" she asked, coming up beside him, still in her wedding dress, shoes long since abandoned somewhere near the cake table. "Only that it took 13 years, he said, pulling her against him, her back to his chest, both of them facing the water. "I keep doing the math. 19 to 32. 13 years I could have had this instead of pretending I didn't want it. Your mother would say the timing was exactly right. That you needed all 13 years to become someone capable of actually choosing it properly, instead of just wanting it from a distance. My mother," Nathaniel said, "has an infuriating habit of being right about things I'd very much prefer she wasn't right about." Elena laughed, tipping her head back against his shoulder, watching the last of the light fade over the lake where a truck had once idled, where a dock had once refused to survive a single winter, where two people had finally, after 13 years, stopped pretending and started building something meant to last. "For the record," she said quietly, "she never apologized. For the invitations. For any of it. She never will," Nathaniel agreed. "She considers the outcome sufficient justification for the method." "I've started to agree with her." "So have I," he said, turning her gently to face him, the last light catching the ring on her finger, the dock steady beneath them both. "So have I." 3 years passed the way Eleanor had always promised they would, quietly and completely, in the accumulation of small ordinary things that neither Elena nor Nathaniel had ever expected to find so satisfying. The community housing project Elena had fought the city planning board over for 8 months broke ground the spring after the wedding and opened its doors the following winter, and she stood at the ribbon cutting in a coat 2 sizes too big because she was 7 months pregnant and had refused, on principle, to buy anything more formal for an event where she intended to spend most of the afternoon crouched down talking to contractors about drainage. Nathaniel had rearranged an entire quarterly board meeting to be there, standing at the back of the small crowd the same way he had at her planning hearing years earlier, though this time he made no pretense of coincidence. "You cannot keep doing this," Elena told him afterward, though she was smiling too widely for the complaint to land with any real force. "You have a company to run." "I have a company that runs extremely well without me hovering over every decision," he said, resting a hand against the curve of her stomach with the same careful, focused attention he brought to nothing else in his life. "I have exactly one of these happening. I intend to be present for the parts that matter." Eleanor, for her part, had taken to referring to the baby, still 2 months from arriving, as though it had already fully formed opinions and a complete personality, updating Elena weekly on the nursery renovations happening at the main house with a thoroughness that suggested she considered grandmotherhood the single most important project of her 64 years, more consuming even than the wedding invitation scheme that had started everything. "I have found," Eleanor announced one Sunday dinner, passing a bowl of the same stew she'd been making since before Elena was born, "the perfect crib. It was your grandmother's, Nathaniel, shipped over from the old house before it sold. I had it restored." "Mother, we haven't discussed a crib yet." "I have discussed it thoroughly. With myself. The matter is settled." Elena caught Nathaniel's eye across the table, both of them fighting identical smiles, because this had become the established rhythm of their family in the years since the wedding, Eleanor deciding things with characteristic certainty, the two of them pretending, briefly, to object, before discovering that she had, once again, been entirely right. The baby came in March, 3 weeks early, during a particularly aggressive spring storm that knocked out power across half the county and forced Nathaniel to drive Elena to the hospital through sheets of rain with the same white-knuckled panic he had never once shown in a boardroom, not even during the worst weeks of the Vivian scandal 3 years earlier. "You are considerably calmer during multi-million-dollar contract negotiations," Elena informed him between contractions, with the particular clarity that came from being in active labor and therefore having no patience left for tact. "Multi-million-dollar contract negotiations have never once made me responsible for another human being's entire existence," he said, gripping her hand so tightly she'd have complained if she'd had the energy to spare. Their son arrived at 4:12 in the morning, screaming with the same stubborn intensity his mother brought to zoning board arguments, and Nathaniel held him for the first time with hands that shook exactly the way they had beside the lake 3 years earlier, and Elena, exhausted and radiant and entirely undone, watched the most controlled man she had ever known come apart completely over 8 pounds of furious, red-faced infant. "He has your jaw," she said softly. "He has your stubbornness." I could hear it in the scream. They named him Theodore, after Nathaniel's father, with Ward tucked into the middle the way Elena had quietly insisted on the day she found out she was pregnant, a small, permanent thread connecting her son to the mother he would never meet, to the woman who had spent 11 years in the Ashford kitchen and raised a daughter capable of loving a boy who taught her to ride a bicycle without either of them realizing, for 13 years, exactly what that meant. Eleanor arrived at the hospital before the sun had fully risen, having apparently been informed by Marcus, who Nathaniel had called in the frantic hour before the birth and who had, with characteristic efficiency, alerted the entire extended family before either new parent had thought to do so themselves. She held her grandson with the same serene, unbothered confidence with which she had once orchestrated an entire wedding switch, and looked down at his small furious face with an expression Elena had never seen on her before, something soft and unguarded and entirely without agenda. 15 years, Eleanor said quietly, mostly to herself. "I waited 15 years for this exact outcome, and I would not change a single decision that got us here, including the ones that involved considerable deception." "You could apologize for the deception at some point," Elena offered, only half serious. "I could," Eleanor agreed, not looking up from the baby. "I have decided I won't. Some things are worth doing badly on purpose, if the outcome is worth it. Ask my grandson, someday, when he's old enough to appreciate the story of how his parents actually met." Nathaniel, watching his mother hold his son in the pale gray light of the hospital room, reached for Elena's hand and found it already reaching for his, the same instinctive gesture that had carried them through a stolen wedding, a truck confession, a ruined loaf of bread, and a proposal beside a lake that had finally learned to hold its shape through winter. "Some things," he agreed quietly, "are absolutely worth doing badly on purpose." The kitchen in the guest cottage, which had long since stopped being called the guest cottage and simply become home, though Eleanor still occasionally referred to it that way out of decades-old habit, smelled like rosemary and the particular chaos of a family finding its own rhythm. Nathaniel stood at the stove with Theodore balanced on one hip, 2 years old now, dark-eyed and stubborn-jawed and utterly convinced that dinner preparation was a spectator sport requiring his direct commentary. "Dada, that's burning." "It is not burning, Theodore, it is caramelizing, which is an entirely different and more sophisticated process." "It's burning." Elena, seated at the table with a stack of blueprints she was supposed to be reviewing before a client meeting the next morning, did not look up, though her shoulders were shaking with barely contained laughter. "He's not wrong, you know. I can smell it from here." "You are both extremely unhelpful," Nathaniel informed his family, sliding the pan off the heat with the same focused precision he brought to every task involving his son, which was to say considerably more focus than the task actually required, and considerably less competence than 4 years of practice should have produced. He had gotten marginally better at cooking since the ruined loaf of bread that started everything, though marginally was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and Elena had learned, over the years, that his kitchen disasters were rarely actually about the food. They were about presence, about a man who had spent his 20s building a version of himself that delegated everything, insulated by assistants and staff and the particular loneliness of extraordinary wealth, discovering, in his 30s, the specific satisfaction of doing small, ordinary, imperfect things for the people he loved with his own 2 hands, badly, on purpose, because the trying mattered more than the result. "The Henderson project got approved today," Elena said, setting down her pen. "Full funding. Groundbreakings in April." "I know. I read the announcement before lunch." "You could pretend to be surprised." "I could," Nathaniel said, setting Theodore down and depositing a plate of something that had, despite the earlier crisis, turned out reasonably edible. "But then you'd know I was pretending, and you'd hold it against me for weeks." She smiled, because he knew her well enough by now that it had stopped being impressive and started simply being comfortable, the particular ease of 2 people who had built something real out of a chaos neither of them had asked for. Dinner was simple: roasted vegetables, the not quite burnt chicken, bread from the bakery near the office because Elena had once mentioned, years ago, that their sourdough reminded her of a bakery from architecture school, and Nathaniel had remembered, the way he remembered everything that mattered to her, quietly, without ever making a production of it. They ate. They talked about the Henderson project, about Eleanor's latest scheme, this one involving Marcus and a woman from the county planning office Eleanor had decided, with characteristic certainty, would suit him perfectly, whether Marcus had asked for matchmaking or not. Theodore narrated the entire meal from his booster seat with the running commentary of a toddler discovering the full range of his own opinions, occasionally flinging a piece of chicken across the room for reasons that remained entirely his own. After dinner, while Elena rinsed the dishes despite Nathaniel's repeated insistence that he'd handle it, an argument that had become one of their favorite small, ongoing battles, an endless gentle war of stubbornness neither of them actually wanted to win, she heard him settle Theodore onto the living room rug with a stack of blocks and heard, a moment later, the specific creak of the front door, and Marcus's voice, arriving unannounced the way he'd taken to doing more often since his own life had started shifting in directions Eleanor had very much orchestrated. "You're going to want to see this," Marcus said, holding up his phone as Elena dried her hands and came around the corner. "Vivian Calloway just announced her engagement. To Callum Reyes. The Northbridge partnership everyone assumed died 4 years ago apparently just got very, very real." Nathaniel, still on the floor building a wobbly tower of blocks with his son, didn't look up. "Good for them. I hope the paperwork is more honest this time." "That's it?" No reaction. "Marcus, I have a 2-year-old attempting to eat a wooden block and a wife whose housing project just got full municipal funding. I genuinely do not have room in my life for reactions to Vivian Calloway anymore. I haven't for years." He glanced up finally, catching Elena's eye across the room, something warm and settled passing between them. Some doors close so quietly you don't even notice until you look back and realize how grateful you are they did. Elena crossed the room and settled onto the rug beside her husband and son, reaching for a block. Theodore immediately, cheerfully, threw at her instead, and thought, not for the first time, that the wedding that never happened had been the single luckiest catastrophe of her entire life. Eleanor Ashford turned 65 that autumn, and the family celebrated at the boathouse by the lake, the same one she had started renovating months before either her son or Elena had officially admitted anything to each other, the same one where a proposal had happened beside water that had finally, stubbornly, learned to hold a dock through winter. Theodore, 3 now and considerably more mobile than anyone found convenient, spent most of the party attempting to launch himself into the lake fully clothed, thwarted repeatedly by Marcus, who had appointed himself unofficial toddler wrangler for the evening, partly out of genuine affection and partly, Elena suspected, to impress the woman from the county planning office who Eleanor had indeed successfully introduced him to, and who was currently laughing at something he'd said from across the lawn. Elena found Eleanor near the water's edge, watching the sunset with a glass of wine and the particular stillness of a woman entirely satisfied with the shape her life had taken. "You never did apologize," Elena said, settling beside her. "For the invitations? For any of it?" "No," Eleanor agreed placidly. "I decided against it years ago, and I remain firm in that decision. I redirected one set of invitations and gained a daughter, a grandson, and watched my son become the version of himself he'd spent a decade too afraid to be. I consider the math extremely favorable." Elena laughed, leaning her head against Eleanor's shoulder the way she had as a child, back when Eleanor was simply the woman who employed her mother and slipped her scholarship applications and showed up at every school recital that mattered. "My mother would have liked you even more than she already did, watching this." "Your mother," Eleanor said quietly, her hand finding Elena's, "would have liked exactly this. All of it. She always said you had too much sense to fall for anyone who couldn't keep up with you. It took your husband 13 years to catch up. I simply got tired of waiting for him to notice he already had." Across the lawn, Nathaniel scooped Theodore up before he could make a fourth attempt at the lake, tossing him into the air until the boy shrieked with the particular unfiltered joy of a child who trusted, completely, that he would always be caught. Nathaniel laughed too, the sound of it carrying across the water, unguarded in a way the boardrooms and courtrooms of his old life had never once permitted, and when he glanced over and found Elena watching him, he smiled the smile he had only ever worn since the day a wedding invitation got redirected to the wrong address and, against every careful plan either of them had built their lives around, sent the right bride walking down the aisle after all. "For the record," Elena called across the lawn, "he still can't cook." "For the record," Nathaniel called back, setting Theodore down and letting him run straight for his mother, "I never once claimed I could. I only ever claimed I'd keep trying, badly, on purpose, for as long as it took." Theodore collided into Elena's legs, laughing, and she scooped him up the same way his father had, and Eleanor watched the three of them from the water's edge with the deep, unshakable satisfaction of a woman who had spent 15 years waiting for exactly this evening, and would, if asked, do every single reckless, deceptive, perfectly calculated part of it again without a moment's hesitation. Some plans, she had always believed, were worth the mess it took to build them. This one, watching her son laugh beside the lake with his wife and their son in the fading light, had turned out to be worth every single risk. If this story moved you, take a moment to like it, leave a comment telling us your favorite part, and subscribe for more stories just like Elena and Nathaniel's. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter of a family built on the best kind of beautiful mistake. Thank you so much for watching this story all the way to the end, and we will see you very soon in the next one.